Sorry? We'll talk afterwards. I'm just waiting for the live streaming to start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Free Market Foundation's briefing on the IRP, the draft IRP 2018, one of the most important developments in the energy sector of this decade. This morning, I want to welcome a lot of people from various sectors within the industry on both sides. Very welcome to you, and nice to see you here. And very welcome to the members of the media as well. I'm Jane Boccolione, and I manage media relations for the Free Market Foundation. Just before I go any further, first of all, temperature. How are you feeling? Too hot? It's a very hot day outside. Shall I moderate it a little? It's cold enough.
It's okay, no, it's going to get
Okay. And also, before we get underway, I would like to stress that the Free Market Foundation's position on energy is neutral. We are completely energy neutral. We do not take a position on the kind of energy, the sources of energy, or the mix, other than it should be a rational and balanced mix, because nobody knows the future. So what we are looking for is low-cost, reliable energy, and that is our bias, if any. Apart from that, we are energy neutral. We have a very distinguished speaker with us today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Anthonie Cilliers. He is his PhD in nuclear engineering. He also has a master's degree in computing and electrical engineering. He's widely published author and commentator on energy, and he has 16 years, I believe, in the energy field. He's an honorary research fellow at WITS and lectures in nuclear technology and engineering. He's married. His wife is also a nuclear scientist. He has 2 kids. I asked him whether they were following in his footsteps, and he said, well, they're only 5 and 7, but already they know that wind and solar are bad. So he said. Dr. Cilliers is going to speak for about 50 minutes. I think he's happy to take questions as we go through. We are live streaming, so you will be on YouTube. And then after that, Leon Lowe, the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation, will make some closing comments. So if I may hand over to Dr. Cilliers, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? So I just want to correct something. My kids, they say solar and wind are bad, but I'm not against solar and wind. I'm actually just looking out for how the whole system is put together, and I think we need to be balanced in how we do things. And I'll explain a little bit about that to you during this presentations. I want to start off with saying that I'm really getting tired of all these discussions, because we've been going at it now for, I think, 10 years, that we've been talking about the different energy sources, and it ends up being mudslinging and not a rational discussion. If somebody takes a certain position, then there are a bunch of people that goes in the complete opposite direction and trying to really to discredit the opinions rather than to debate on the opinions. So I'm going to try to really have a discussion on where we're at today in South Africa. We have load shedding currently at the moment, and I want to talk about what is our options and where can we go. And that means that we need to use all our options. So I want to start off with saying, are we in trouble in South Africa today? And this is a picture of our electricity supply in the country, and you can see each and every little of those lines represent a power station. And you can see that by 2030 we see this massive cliff edge of losing supply. Now we could stretch that, doesn't mean that this is going to happen, but we're seeing it happening already. The power stations that we have currently available is losing capacity due to maintenance that needs to be done more and more as they age. We all know if we drive a car, the older it gets, the more maintenance it requires. Okay, at some point it doesn't become economical to drive that anymore. Okay, so this is what we're facing, and the reason we see load shedding today This is one of the reasons. We have more and more maintenance that we need to do, and these maintenance are being moved out because we need the supply today. Okay, so we decide not to do the maintenance because we need the supply. When are we going to do that maintenance? Okay, so that's a really difficult situation. This is not the only problem. We hear in the news a lot about coal supply problems and all these things. But our biggest issue is we are losing supply really fast. And by 2030, by 2032 about, we'll sit under 20,000 megawatts available on the grid. Okay? And we are projecting that this will go up to 2050 to about to over 52 gigawatts of electricity demand if the country can maintain its growth. Okay? By the way, we are not having load shedding at the moment. We are having rolling blackouts. Okay? Load shedding has been happening for the last 10 years, where industry has committed to reducing load to keep things going. Okay? And that has hurt the economy. Okay. At the moment, we have rolling blackouts that is happening in stages all over the country. All right? Load shedding means you reduce your load so that you don't have rolling blackouts. And that has been happening. And we've been hearing for the last couple of years that we have an oversupply, right? Everybody knows, everybody's talking about we have an oversupply. Okay? This is not the case. We had additional supply available because of industries committing to using less electricity. And our economy has suffered. So if we want our economy to grow, we really need to do something. Okay? It's not decoupled. A lot of people saying we're moving towards a service-related economy. That's not where we should be going. We have been deindustrializing for the last 10 years because of the constraint on electricity supply. And that's really problematic. So this is where we're at. We have no idea what's going to come here. And the IRP 2018 proposed a plan to replace this. Okay, between now and 2030, it had a fixed plan with a mix of wind, solar, and gas, and some forced the DRC hydro plan coming in, 2,000 megawatts of that, and another 1,000 megawatts of coal coming in, going up to 2030, and then beyond that, the plan is fairly open with a couple of scenarios. And we'll look at how these scenarios will pan out. But before we go there, I think we need to talk about how do we change how the electricity sector or the costing of electricity is structured, because that is something we see internationally. So I called this the typical load profile in South Africa and the utility death spiral. Okay, so we all have heard about the utility death spiral. Have you heard of it? Okay, what the utility death spiral means, and it happens all around the world. South Africa is not unique. The big power utilities are losing revenue to other sectors, private sectors coming in, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, but how it is structured, somebody needs to keep things going. Now this profile, and I'm showing this profile of it. This is a 24-hour profile of the month of October, a couple of years ago. I think it was 2013. This one. So you see, early in the morning there's a very low demand, and then it goes up, and then during the day the demand comes down again, and it peaks again in the afternoon. Okay, we all are aware of this is the typical electricity demand that's happening. In winter, these peaks are more pronounced, okay, because in summertime we tend to use air conditioning and things like that more during the day, so this goes, lifts up a little bit, the centerpiece. Okay, so what this means is that there are expensive periods of electricity supply, and there are less expensive, of high value electricity supply and low value electricity supply. Okay? And that traditionally has always been cross subsidized. Okay? The reason for this cross subsidizing was that all energy sources were the same. If you had a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a hydro plant, they were all dispatchable, and you could run them whenever you wanted to run them. You could control them. Okay, so what happened was, this is expensive supply, this is cheap supply, and we get an average of these two costs to get to a tariff structure, right? Okay. Now we see a different scenario, because now we have different types of energy sources coming in. And I put a little picture here. The easiest way to see that is when solar PV comes in, it starts producing during the middle of the day. Okay? During winter, it's a little bit worse because then this level is deeper here. What that means is that this dip that you see during the day becomes deeper and deeper because of this additional supply that the utility don't supply anymore. Okay? Everybody follows. What that then means is this subsidizing of these expensive times, when you usually run things like gas turbines and diesel generators and those type of things, can't happen anymore. Because the utility is not earning their money in the center part anymore. So they can't subsidize that area. So what do the utilities do? They need to increase the prices. Okay? So utility come, they say, I need to pay for these peaks. I'm not getting my income during these times. I need to increase the prices. That's inevitable. It happens. It's going to happen, and it happens worldwide. So it becomes more and more expensive. Okay? The same accounts for wind, but it's more spread out. So you might have the wind turbines blowing over here, and then the utility loses their revenue in this area over here. And sometimes it happens over here as well, and then it's a bonus. Okay, but it's more spread out. But the point is, the utilities will always push their prices up. What that then means is people defect from the grid even more because it starts making more sense, right? I'm going to put more solar panels on my roof because my utility is getting more and more expensive, which means I make a bigger dip over here, the utility supplying this over there, and the utility puts the price up to fund that part. It's a spiral that doesn't end, or it doesn't end well. Okay, it's something that if we do not regulate it, it's not going to solve our problems. The only way that we can solve this, and this needs to happen internationally, is if we start paying the market value of the electricity at the time that it's produced. So if it's low value electricity at the time, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, when nobody's using it, the market value is very low. Okay? Open market system. Then the generating stations will receive less income for that area, and if it produces during these peak hours, you can earn more. Okay, so it should be open on an open market system. At the moment, we've got the IPPs running, and the IPPs are called must runs. Okay, the moment they're selling electricity at R2.22 per kilowatt hour to Eskom, okay, and they get first access to the grid. So whenever they're available, if they're available during this time, or this time, it goes onto the grid and Eskom pays. From there on, you have a market-related system where the cheapest power stations come online first, up to the most expensive one. The diesel gens come on last. Okay, and that would happen usually during these times. Okay, so at the moment we have a very expensive system sitting at the bottom, running first, and then from there on, the cheapest and going more expensive. Okay, so that's really a problem because we all rely on these peaks, and the utility is supposed to provide that peaks for us. I've often said that if you want to use your own electricity, also provide your own backup, or you'll have to, at some point, they'll have to restructure it that you have to pay in for the reliability of the grid. You cannot expect the grid to be there when you want it, but when it's cheaper, you don't have it. The average cost all over will always increase because you're adding more capital, you're increasing the capital system for electricity, which is not running half of the time. Okay, so the average price will always be more. I can put more solar panels on my roof. I might save a bit of money. The only reason I might save is because I'm the only guy with the solar panels on the roof. Once everybody does it, the whole average price will just go up. Does that make sense to everybody? And that's something that we need to solve. We need to completely restructure this. We've been very clever in introducing an independent power producer program, and in most parts it's been successful for the independent power producers. But we need to solve this problem going forward for the country to solve the whole life cycle and not only the front end of it, because that's what we've done. We've only created the front end. Yes?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
You've made made an implicit assumption that the solar is not owned by the utility. What happens if that solar were owned by the utility? Could you just take us through that?
Yeah.
Just as a
That would be the same scenario. The difference is the utility would then have to cost whatever the solar costs. So if the utility would probably not build an expensive system for this time of day. Okay, if they can provide it in this area, they would do that. And what we see today is Eskom has announced a couple of weeks ago that they're investing, I think, 90 million, a massive amount of money, into battery storage. Okay? The reason why, a lot of people asked, why are they doing that? It's a lot of money for storage. It's not even generating electricity. The reason they're doing it is to increase the value of the electricity that's supplied at the wrong time of day. Okay? So you would not want, because the value of that electricity isn't even the cheap price that you're getting it at in most cases. So you might say, okay, solar PV is coming at 82 cents. The value of that electricity during that time of day is probably 70 or 60 cents.
Sorry,
So,
I don't want to get into a whole
sure.
discussion here. What's quite interesting, of course, is that the electricity that's being produced by the baseload stuff in the middle of the night has got the least value because the demand is the lowest. So it's a little bit perhaps over-exaggerated to say that daytime electricity in that slight trough between the morning and the afternoon peak is useless electricity. I would argue that if the sun shone in the middle of the night, it wouldn't be that great because we use much less electricity in the middle of the night. So it shines when we actually use electricity.
Absolutely, and in summertime that's great. Because as you can see, this dip is getting smaller in summer. In winter, it's a much bigger dip, and then the sun isn't even that bright. But as you can see with baseload supply, we try to have the baseload, that green line there, to always to never be able have to go up or down and then cross subsidizing it. So yeah, these two peaks are the ones that's problematic. What we have seen in South Africa recently is this peak is getting smaller, okay, and this peak is getting bigger, okay, which is problematic because the sun doesn't shine at that time. The reason why we don't see this is a sign of deindustrializing of a country, because this is when everybody gets home and start up their homes in the evenings. This peak is when all the factories and industries are starting up. Well, some of the parts that don't run 24 hours. Okay, so as we deindustrialize as a country, we see this morning peak going even smaller, and then this peak actually growing a little bit, or at least relative to the other peaks. So that's quite problematic. The important part is that we cannot cross-subsidize between the low value times and the expensive times anymore. We have to pay for the electricity what it's worth. The nice thing about this, if we do it right, is it also incentivizes the other energy sources. If I'm a IPP and I produce solar power and I can get only 50 cents or 60 cents per kilowatt hour during this time of day, I could afford, and that's what Eskom is doing, to install batteries to store the energy to move it to a more expensive time. And over here, I could probably get 3-4 rand per kilowatt hour because it's being cross-subsidized. Okay, so it also incentivizes the right movements as a free market does. Yes.
I'd like to make 2 points. That deindustrializing is about the worst thing that can happen to us.
Yes.
Because our advantage lies in our labor.
Absolutely.
The course of buying a whole whack of batteries is about second, maybe the same cost, when there are alternative ways of storing that energy, pumping water to a height or other things. I can't think of any more. But that, for instance, the Snowy Mountain scheme in Australia must be 60 years old now.
Yeah.
No,
deindustrializing is really bad for South Africa. We have resources in this country, we are rich on resources, and our mining sector and all our industries should keep going. And that's what suffered. And we see that even with the economic data that came out yesterday, that those are the areas that's suffering. And we're not going to get out of that. The 27% unemployed people are not going to start working in the banks tomorrow. They need jobs in industries. And that's something that we need to find solutions for. And that goes back to this slide showing we need a lot of electricity to get this going. And we need it at an affordable price. Going on, so now the IRP 2018, and please, I want to not sound like that I'm anti-renewable energy. I'm really pro-renewable, although it doesn't sound like that often. I am anti a silver bullet approach. I do not believe that we have one single solution that can solve it, and I'll show you here what the problem is. So the IRP 2018 is proposing a wind, solar, gas mix. They assume that the gas will only be there to fill the gaps when the wind and the solar is not available. Now, what have we seen internationally? This is for wind, okay? So this is a correlation graph, the distance between wind turbines and the correlation between when the wind is available, okay? This is a distance of 3,000 kilometers. It goes below the negative line at about 2,500 kilometers. This means that the distance between two wind farms that's further than 2,500 kilometers away from each other would actually, one would provide wind when the other one doesn't have wind. Okay? So the argument is that the wind will always blow somewhere. Well, that's not really true. If you look at this correlation, and this is for the whole of Europe, that if the wind is blowing in Europe, it's blowing everywhere in Europe. And if it's not blowing, it's not blowing in Europe. Okay? And that is because these high pressure and low pressure systems that move across a country are huge. They are massive. They are the size of continents that move across. So it doesn't help to add more and more and more of the same supply and thinking you're going to spread it out to get your perfect curve. Okay? Which is the argument. So this is between Norway, Denmark in the further side, and this is Spain on the other side. If you can have that distance from each other, you have a better chance of being able to produce electricity all the time. Okay, but then you have to transport that electricity all the way across the continent. So that doesn't work. Okay, and what we've seen internationally is that your limit is about 20% penetration in your grid. Okay, there's no country in the world that can get more than 20%, and that's stretching it, of wind penetration into the grid. Okay, that means for a 50 gigawatt network, you can get about 10 gigawatts of wind out of it. Realistically, scientifically speaking, based on this. Solar PV, we see the same scenario. It's easier to understand this one because the sun is shining only at the same time of the day. So once you start producing more, building more capacity than what your grid requires, you start losing that electricity, or you have to send it out to other grids and so on. So what we've seen here's a whole bunch of countries. It's a little bit small. Greece, Germany, Spain, all of them. And you see as they built, they were growing quite fast because when you start installing these systems, they quickly add up. You see how they get into the, because everything available goes onto the grid. Okay? Up to about 10%. Then you see it starts tapering off. Okay, so that is your limit of what solar capacity you can actually install. All right? It helps if you've got a lot of neighbors that you can export your excess electricity to, but it becomes more and more costly because you're installing, you can double the capacity for only a 0.5% increase once you get to that point. Okay, and what we also see is that the combined penetration of these two together is roughly 30%, which is high because then it assumes that the wind will always be blowing when the sun is not shining. Okay, that combination, so that it helps each other out. Okay, so I did a little case study, and this is just simply testing what our IRP 2018 assumptions will allow. Yes?
So you're talking about solar PV. Is there any way of storing that excess?
Yes. I think in the news this week there's been a lot of talk about the CSP plant. There's been a CSP plant up in Uppington that was just launched, and that is what we call concentrated solar power. So they've got these big mirrors, and the heat is actually concentrated onto a solar salt that heats up, and then that's stored in massive tanks. Okay, the cost of those additional systems, the extra molten salt that stores the heat and then can produce electricity later, is quite a bit. So it adds cost. And then that brings us back again to changing the payment structure. Because once you start saying, but I can move my solar PV from 12 o'clock in the day to 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening with additional cost, I can also earn more money because it's in a higher value time. At the moment, that doesn't work. So it doesn't make economical sense to add that additional cost to store it and move it for me as why? Because I'll earn the same amount of money, or I'll just become really expensive. You understand? So you need to restructure the funding system so that I can earn more money when the electricity is more available. And that's just how it should be. And for the CSPs, they do have sort of a split. During certain times, they can earn a little bit more. But at the moment, it's very expensive. Yes?
Prof. Cilliers, I just maybe wanted to clarify that the CSP plant that is being celebrated, the power purchase agreement that they have signed with Eskom, it gives them a tariff off-peak, which is during the day, at 3 Rand 40 cents per kilowatt hour.
Off-peak.
Off-peak, that is during the day. When they stored that electricity to then release it during peak period, which is between 5 and 9 p.m., that same kilowatt hour that they would have stored, they charge Eskom 5 Rand 62 cents per kilowatt hour. Except that Eskom has to sell that same kilowatt hour for the regulated price of currently is at 92 cents per kilowatt hour. So whether it's off-peak or during peak period, the mathematics is horribly bad for the economy.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. So that is, it just shows you we're still sitting in a very expensive technology, and we sort of, it feels like we are being prepared for this getting worse. And I'll show you a few slides coming up about that as well. Yes, there's a question at the back.
Yeah, just a point here, and people often lose sight of the fact you cannot supply electricity and store it at the same time.
Yes, that's correct.
And so therefore you got to double your capacity in order to store. In fact, more than double capacity.
Yeah, that's correct. A lot of people are actually saying that the capacity factor of the CSP plants is higher than for PV plants. It's not. It's the same capacity factors, maybe slightly more because it's a little bit more efficient system. But all it does is it shifts the same amount of electricity that you used to produce, it shifts it to a new time. So if you shift it, you lose it when you had it. So you have to double the capacity. So the capacity factor of these plants are sitting at around 26%, which means that of all the nameplate capacity, only 26% of that is actually being delivered onto the grid on average over a year. Over a year period. So this is really important. We need to understand that all these little pieces are coming at a cost. And again, this CSP plant that we've been talking about now is expensive all over the day. So you can't cross-subsidize with the tariff as it is today. Okay, but just getting back to the German case study. So in Germany today, they've got a 45 gigawatt of installed solar capacity. They've got 58 gigawatt of installed wind capacity. Combined, it's 103.9, almost 104 gigawatts of wind and solar installed onto their grid. The maximum demand in Germany is 77 gigawatts. Okay, compared to us, at some point we were at around 40 gigawatts, and at the moment we're quite a bit lower. But that means so they've got 134% of their peak demand installed in wind and solar. Okay? While their solar, you can see on this graph on the side, the yellow one is solar, sitting at 9.1% penetration of the grid. Okay? And wind is sitting at 19.4%. This is for 2018 data. Okay? And combined, they get 28.5% of their total production on average for 134% peak demand installed. So you install a massive amount to get to this penetration. Okay? And in South Africa, our IRP 2018 is saying that everything we build from now until 2050, the least cost scenario, what they're talking about, will be made up of solar, wind, and gas to fill the gaps. I see that as extremely problematic. I think we should go for 30%, and if we get there, we might consider going on. But it's extremely damaging to plan from now until 2050 for something that not even Germany has done, and it has cost them almost €1 trillion to do this in subsidies and costs. Okay, we were talking about the magic trillion rand number, and we've heard about this is trillion euros that it's been costing Germany to get to this. Okay, so this is something that the silver bullet approach is not working. Now I need to talk about the independent power producers. So what about them? What are we not told? Okay, so this is our production, electricity production graph at the moment on the left-hand side. You can see that, and you can see the share of each of the different energy sources producing the full total gigawatt hours being produced. Okay, and you can see there's nuclear sitting at the top, and it produces a slightly little bit more than what the IPPs are producing at the moment. Okay, and then you have some hydro, some wind, some gas, pump storage, and there's your coal, the big bulk of what the electricity is produced in South Africa. And at the bottom you can see there's some transmission imports, some wheel withdrawals, and some distribution supplies as well. Okay, so this gives you an indication of what the size is of this supply. On the right-hand side, you can see what is the cost of these contributions. So you can see nuclear is sitting there. For that contribution on the left-hand side, this is the cost. 0.4 is in billions, so it's 500 million a year that it's costing for Coburg to the energy cost from Coburg. This one over here is the IPP cost. For producing that from IPPs, this is what it's costing. Okay, and then of course the coal one. This is roughly, I think it's about roughly 23% of the total cost. And this is 4.5% of the total electricity generated. Okay, so on the left-hand side, I hope you can see the thickness of the lines over here. Okay, so the thickness of the lines represent the contribution to the electricity. So you've got nuclear at the top, you've got IPPs. So nuclear has got 12,400 gigawatt hours a year producing. IPPs 11,700 gigawatt hours. Hydro 930, wind 280, gas turbines 30, pump storage 4,200, and then the coal 202,000 of the 243,000. Okay, so that's it's its share of contribution to the generation mix. Then the cost over here in billions, Coburg R500 million a year. IPPs 26.6 billion rand a year. Gas turbines 0.345, coal 54,400. Okay, so it's roughly double what the IPPs are costing, but it produces a whole lot more electricity. And now there's the average, and the reason for this is this average price for primary energy. IPPs are coming in at R2.27 per kilowatt hour. Coal 27 cents, nuclear 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, there's additional costs that's all sitting within Eskom. So this is the primary energy costs of what it is to produce the energy per kilowatt hour additional after all the overheads are covered. Of course, the IPPs have got their own overheads, but it's covered inside here because they're sitting outside the utility. Okay, but that is what it's costing. All right. Now a lot of people say yes, but this IPPs are passed through to the consumer. Ever heard of that? The cost is passed through to the consumers. Okay, that means, simply put, that NERSA, when they evaluate the costing of the tariff, if they evaluate what the electricity price increase should be, is they say we've got a fixed cost of R2.27. The IPPs must get their money. Okay, what is left and what the consumer can afford will be given as an increase to the utility. Okay, a lot of people say no, but the utility it doesn't do anything to the utility. The money is just coming in and going out. Okay, that is not the truth, because NERSA limits the increase that the utility can get, but it has no control over what the IPPs are getting. Okay, and that is problematic because you could do three things with this money. Okay, the first one is you could decrease the price of electricity for the consumers if you wanted to. It could be cheaper for the consumers. The second one is you could use this money to do maintenance on the plants, which we can't afford right now as a country. We can't afford to do the maintenance. Okay, And the third one is Eskom could probably make a profit. Okay, that's what you could do with this money. Okay, which is not none of those three are happening at the moment. Yes.
I just want to make one observation.
Sure.
I think it will be useful for everybody over here.
Okay.
The form of the PPAs for the renewable energy projects, there are no capacity payments, it's only energy payments.
Correct.
So if they're available to produce, even if they're not producing, even if they're not connected to the grid, they still get paid.
Yes, correct.
That's important.
That's very important. Okay, so that is why, and people say no, but this pass-through protects Eskom. It's not. This is designed to protect the IPPs. That's what it's there for. It's there so that the IPP can get the guarantees of having an income so that they can fund the capital, which is not a bad thing if you want to protect them, but you can't do it to the detriment of the utility, which is really the backbone. There's a question and then there.
I'm a bit confused about your costing.
Yeah.
That coal cost, is it the cost of the coal or is it the cost of the coal power station?
No, the power stations are not in here. Okay, so this is for every additional kilowatt hour being produced. No, you are if you look at the payment system, because what is on Eskom's books? What capital is on the balance sheet of the utility?
No, but the point is, if you got the risk of the renewable energy is not borne by Eskom.
Sure.
And if you compare a Medupi and a Kusile with that now, if you've got a power plant that you can only dispatch 50% of the time because you botched up the coal sales, you still have to pay the interest and the capital.
Sure.
And that cost should be there, otherwise we're comparing apples and lemons here.
Yes, that's correct. This is the cost of producing a kilowatt hour, not of paying off the capital, because the capital is on the balance sheet of the system.
The renewables includes the capital.
But it's not on the balance sheet of Eskom, because this is what it's costing Eskom.
But then you've got a spurious argument here. It's not really.
Well,
you've got to compare apples with apples.
Okay.
Yes. Can I assist you there? National Treasury has guaranteed the capital cost of the independent power producers currently to the tune of 203 billion rand. So they are guaranteed. They're not on the balance sheet of Eskom, but they are on the national balance sheet of the country. It's an obligation that South Africa, through National Treasury, carries, which in turn means that there can be no event of default. If there is default, Treasury has to sign a check of 203 billion rand, and then the problem is solved. So they are guaranteed. It is not a question that they pose no capital obligation whatsoever or burden on the state. And in turn, not only is that the case, but their cost, which is reflected there by Professor Cilliers, is that cost of 26 billion rand, which is just under 5% of the total energy supplied and transmitted by Eskom, that cost is actually passed on to the consumer, which is you and I. So it is a bad deal either way.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just to concur with the gentleman here, I think you're comparing a fully capitalized cost on the IPP with an operating cost on the other. Would it not be better to look at, you've got that capacity gap come 2030, so there's going to have to be new build in extra capacity. So the levelized cost of new coal and new nuclear compared to IPP.
Yeah, we're going to get there now. So this is just showing you where it's happening. Okay, there's lots of questions.
Just one
okay, one more.
From,
Yeah?
And then that's it.
Just a comment is, as the IPP has a PPA signed for 20 years,
Yes.
the price of 2.27 will be in 20 years 7 rand.
Okay, we're getting there. I'm going to show you
and
now.
we will have to pay it.
Okay, so this is what's happening with the power purchase agreements. Something that a lot of people don't know. The power purchase agreements are fully indexed for inflation. Okay? That means that you cannot compare that with the levelized cost of electricity from any of the other sources, unless you fully index them as well. And that is something that is, we don't see that in the media because it's not being said. This is what is happening from 2013, 2014, when the first was signed. This is what it cost us in the first year, 2.7 billion rand. That went to 5.1, 14.8, 19.3, and so on. So we're sitting here now at 20 26.6 billion rand annually. And every year it increases with inflation. For this graph, we assumed a 6% inflation rate. That goes up to 52.7 billion by 2032. That's 13 years from now. Okay, so that price is not coming down at all. It's not the R2.22 we're paying today. In today's money, will remain that. Okay, it will go up, but in today's money, it will remain that. We're not gonna get any relief from this additional cost. Yes.
Maybe just Professor Cilliers on the earlier slide. The gentleman raised a very important question, but I think it was not attended to correctly.
Okay.
You must understand when the earlier one. This is just the pure cost per kilowatt. We're not talking capital of any plant. No plant is included in there. We're not talking Eskom plant. We're not talking any other IPP plant. This is just the cost per kilowatt. So I think the argument must be made clear that this is a cost per kilowatt. The sunken cost for Eskom has already been included, and that is why they've already been written off on the balance sheet over the years. As you know, the discounting as well as the depreciation of your capital asset. So this is not a reflection of the capital cost, as is used as the argument continuously, that IPPs are carrying their own capital, and as a result, it should actually, when we look at the cost reflection, we are misrepresenting apples and whatever bananas. I don't care. The aspect of it is Eskom pays per kilowatt. It does not pay your capital asset because it's already amortized its own capital asset, and it's not reflecting it on a kilowatt. So I think the argument should be settled properly without us getting into arguments over who's misrepresenting what.
And it's paying this fee to the IPPs. So this is what it's costing. Okay, but to go on, this is what we see as the cost progress. So by 2022, the 200 billion in foreign investment, or what's been told to us in foreign investment, has already been recovered by the owners of these plants. Okay, from there on, it's profits. Okay, so we must be very careful when we think there's a massive amount of international money, investments coming in. Nobody makes an investment because they want to provide money to the country. Okay, it doesn't happen. You want something back, and by 2033, we'll have cumulatively spent almost 700 billion rand. Okay, on the IPPs, which is producing on average about 2,000 megawatts onto the grid. Okay, 2,000. We were talking about 9,600 megawatt nuclear for the last 10 years, costing R1 trillion. It would have been a better deal. And I'm not saying it is a good deal. Okay, but it would have been a better deal. So this is something that we really are concerned about. But now we can also go on and we say, look at the IRP 2018, and we see how do they treat the cost. And we've presented this in Parliament as well, and the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee concurred with us in their report when they released it. The project unit cost of electricity by 2030 is similar for all scenarios, that's what they're saying, except for market-linked gas prices, in the case of which a market-linked increase in gas prices was assumed instead of an inflation-based increase. So they went to the levelised cost of electricity for today, for all the sources, and then they assumed an inflationary increase on that. In fact, they didn't. They used 2018 money to filter out the inflation. So they're always quoting it in today's money, which is a good thing, but inflation doesn't work the same for capital intensive projects versus fully indexed costing. Okay? So they don't work the same, which is a problem. This is mathematically incorrect. The REIPP program uses inflation indexed pricing and the calculation of LCOE of other energy sources. The total cost will not increase with inflation as the capital cost is spread evenly over time. Okay, it's like buying your house. If I buy my house now, I make sure that I almost can't afford it, but I can. 10 years from now, it's easy to afford it. 20 years from now, it's just a part of your money that you spend because the price stays the same if interest rates don't change. Okay. So only operations, maintenance, and fuel costs will increase with inflation. And me being a nuclear person is calculate that's about 20% of the LCOE cost, which will increase with inflation. The other 80% is capital cost, which does not increase. For coal power stations, that will be a different factor. Okay? But what does that mean? Yes?
Just a quick point, just on
Yeah.
interest. The levelized cost has got nothing to do with the price at which you sell. It's a
Sure.
mechanism to calculate the levelized cost.
You're 100% right.
The price at which you sell is something totally different. And in some of the IPPs, they opted to sell at a fixed price with no inflation linking. So you can't conflate levelized cost. It's got nothing to do with the sale price. It's purely the levelized cost of operating it, both the capital cost amortization and the cost of whatever fuels you use. So you can't conflate price into an argument on levelized cost. You need to separate them and then look at what deal has been struck with regard. And I'm quite sure that the deal struck at the moment, Eskom's more than likely to increase its prices by more than CPI going forward.
Sure. But the cost will remain the same. And that is what we're trying, because the cost to the utility and to the consumer is the one that we're concerned about. I'm not concerned about how you structure your tariff or how you structure your payback internally. I'm concerned about what is it costing to the consumer and ultimately to the consumer, but to the utility. Okay. So this is what is interesting. You have these, for wind and solar, you have these two lines. This is the cost of IPP bid window 4. Okay. 62 cents per kilowatt hour and 82 cents per kilowatt hour, as it is published. Okay. Indexed with inflation. Okay. And this is the cost of a nuclear power plant coming in at R1.20 per kilowatt hour. Okay. LCOE. So that is the cost that it will cost the utility to build it. Am I right?
You're conflating. You're looking backwards.
It's
As one gentleman here said, the way to do this is to go to 2030 and look forward. To look backwards here is backward looking, basically.
Okay, I'm not looking backwards, I'm looking forward. But what's happening here is we're sitting at 62 cents and 82 cents, and every year it will increase. So we've signed it now in April this year, or in February, and every year it will increase. Okay, we can build, according to the IRP 2018, which has got inflated prices for almost all the other energy sources. We can build the same plant, okay, and we can increase the maintenance operations and fuel costs with inflation every year, keep the capital cost fixed as you pay it off, and by after 11 years, you will see that the nuclear price will be lower than that of solar. Of the ones we've signed already, the cheap ones we've signed last, okay? And after 17 years, it will be cheaper than the wind prices that we have signed very cheaply now. And this is not, I'm not saying some signed for index prices or non-index prices. These are all index prices as it's been published for bid window 4. When you don't have the index prices, these prices go up quite a bit. Yes?
So there's a fatal flaw in your assumption. Those are a bit, international bid prices on the renewables.
Yes.
That assumption on the nuclear pricing is extremely low and not supported by a bid price. So you're not, again, you're comparing apples with carrots.
I'm using IRP 2018 data. So IRP 20 data used a high figure, and I could go there for you, but we'll get there. So this price, 120, you assume it's low. I think it's pretty high from what we've seen internationally. But this is what's happening over time. Okay. If you just fix it in 2018 cost, then obviously fully indexed prices will remain the same over time. Okay. And any capital cost that you pay now will actually come down over time with inflation. Okay. Because of the inflation, it actually drops by about 4% per year. Okay. So there you can again see, and this is now the cumulative cost. And I divided that, I normalized that for tariff. So you start at R1.20 per kilowatt hour, and that goes down to, after 60 years, the life of the plant, it goes down to about 40 cents cumulatively. So the average price over the whole period is sitting at 40 cents per kilowatt hour in today's money. Okay? Because of this LCOE coming down. And if you don't take this into account, if you just use everything in today's money, because then you account for inflation for everything. Okay, so this is actually what the real graph looks like, which you were talking about. So this is the figure that the IRP 2018 used, 69,746 Rand and 5 cents. That's the figure they used, based on a study that was done by EPRI, and they they adjusted it a bit for the Asian markets, and they brought it down a little bit. Okay. Incidentally, that same study had wind and solar much more expensive than what we used, because, as you rightly said, you had a competitive bidding process. Competitive bidding process will always result in competition, which will result in a lower price. Okay, which is a good thing. That's great. But we need to be able to separate what we're trying to do here. We're trying to provide electricity supply and electricity security for the country. Okay. So I'm not saying IPPs are bad. I'm saying we should make sure that we get a good deal if we do these things. That's really important. Okay. So at a discount rate of 8.2%, which I also think is a little high, but I'm taking it, and a duration life of 60 years, because you pay off a plant over its entire lifetime of the plant. Okay? And that's how long nuclear power plants are designed for nowadays, the generation 3+ plants, with the option to extend the life with another 20 years to go to 80 years. But we're not taking that into account. Okay. In this case, I used a 1,400 megawatt plant. Doesn't really matter. But this is what the IRP 2018 used as well. Okay. So if you do that, what the IRP did not take into account is learning rates for building more and more plants. Okay. They assumed a flat learning rate, which has never happened in any mega project in the world. Once you do one, they come in very expensive, the first of a kind, and as you go on, they become cheaper with time. Okay, we have data on that, data from Coburg, when Coburg was built. We have data from other vendors, and we've got international data. So the first plant usually comes in at 100% of the price, the second one at about 90%, and it goes down to end up at around 75% of the original plant, just because you build a skill set in your country when you industrialize. Because we'll see Medupi coming in more expensive probably than Kusile. We'll see about that. Okay? If we take those same people, maybe it's a bad example. If we use that same people to build another plant, I'm willing to guarantee you it will go better. Okay? Probably can't go worse, but it will go better. Okay? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a learning rate. Okay, so that means, and I just use this arbitrarily because this is important for economic growth in the future. If you put in a plant, you build it to be in, and this could, I'm using nuclear plants, but it could be coal plants, it could be any dispatchable plant. Okay? If you build them to be ready by 2030, that's your cost. Now I superimposed it on the tariffs that the IRP 2018 produced. Difference is, they assumed everything increases with inflation every year. So they assumed it remains flat over here, and with all the additional cost, that price over time goes up. Okay? But this is what happens in reality. You come in by 2030 at R1.20 per kilowatt hour, okay, in today's money, because all of this is in today's money. Okay? And over time, your capital cost becomes lower. Okay? The cost of what you're paying off per kilowatt hour. That's not the price necessarily that you charge the consumer. Okay? You could charge the consumer less if you wanted to. Okay? Over time. Or you could just fix it to only increase at 1% a year. We've done that in the 80s. We've seen that. Okay? When the plants were built, there was never inflationary connected increases in electricity. It was never necessary because the plants were being paid off. And so we have historical information on that. Okay, building a second plant 2 years later with this learning curve comes in at roughly the same price. By that time, it's only just over R1.10. And every time you build one, it comes in at slightly lower price, and the prices go down over time. Okay, what is important here is it allows you two things. We often hear the thing is the future is uncertain. Okay, nowadays technology is changing so fast. We can't plan ahead 10, 20 years. We have to be agile. You know those type of arguments that's being made? Okay? That's true. But we need to plan the future. Okay? If we can see that the cost that we pay today will actually reduce over time with inflation, as long as this cost reduction beats the technology price decreases, and it does, you do not have the risk of stranded assets. Okay? That's the reason why Coburg will never be a stranded asset. Okay? Coburg is the cheapest electricity producing plant on the grid today. It can only become cheaper. Okay? You can bring more technologies in and that's great. But it will not become a stranded asset because it has paid off its money over time. Okay? So that's the one thing. Yes?
Quick question. When you say another unit, let's say they talked about in the nuclear thing 9,600 megawatts or whatever, and that can be divided into 6 units. 8 units, all right. So when you talk about your reduction there, are you talking about per unit within that 9,600?
Yeah. So the first one would be 1,400. I just used 5. So I don't even know what is 5 times 1,400. But yeah.
The point is one can build incrementally. You don't have to price the whole 9,600. You build incrementally within that. That's
very important point that you're saying. We were talking last week. I heard in the state capture commissions they were mentioning again the trillion rand that the country cannot afford for 9,600 megawatts. Okay, it's R1 trillion spent over 20 years. You don't build 9,600 megawatt of any capacity overnight. It's spent over 20 years. We have seen that the same people making those comments have signed this. Okay, which is costing us R1 trillion for less electricity. Okay, so we need to be very careful when we start making these type of assumptions of big figures and it's so much, it's a percentage of the GDP and so on. The total cost, yes, the total cost will be high over a period of 20 years when you spend it. Okay, there you can see what the annual payment would be of a 1,400 megawatt plant. What is that? 10 billion a year, 11 billion a year that you'll pay back on these plants. Okay, that includes your fuel cost for 1,400 megawatts onto the grid, 90% of that onto the grid. Okay, it's a lot of money, and over time, if you multiply that, you'll get to R1 trillion. Okay, but it's spent over 20 years. Yes.
What's your dollars per kilowatt capacity you've assumed here?
The dollars.
Dollars per kilowatt.
I think, if I remember correctly, it's $5,200. Okay, it's at an exchange rate of 13 rand 57, so you could calculate it. Okay, in my view, it's pretty high. If you go to countries that do this a lot, they don't get to these figures. Okay. Yeah. So, and at the moment, I think our exchange rate is sitting right about there anyway. So, yeah. So the two things that I was talking about. The one is you worry about stranded assets because you're spending a lot of money and you're committing for 60 years. Can we afford to do that? We can if we can ensure that we don't sit with a stranded asset. That the technology, the new technologies that come in will not undercut these prices. Okay? That's why I'm saying we need to plan for the future. We cannot let the future happen and we need to respond to it. It doesn't work like that. And that is something that's been put into our minds for a long period of time, that we need this agility. We need agility, yes, but we need to force the future and what's happening. The second one is the risk of overcapacity. We've seen this in the 80s. In the 80s, it was because of sanctions. It wasn't because we just built too much. Okay, the country had, the industries weren't growing. There was political and social problems that we are not talking about even today. Okay, we've seen that in the 80s. What we see today is a big fear that we are going to build massive amount of supply and it's going to sit there idle, not being used, and then you can't pay it off. And I've heard comments of that like that as well. If you don't use it, you can't pay it off. If you plan it properly, that the price over time comes down, then you can incentivize industry to use it. That's a really great problem to have. Okay? It's a wonderful problem to have. Because when I get to 40 cents per kilowatt hour or to 70 cents per kilowatt hour, I can start telling industry, listen, I'll give you a good price, use this electricity, because all I need to do is I need to pay off my assets. So if we talk about economic growth, this is what we want to achieve. We want to make sure that we don't sit with stranded assets, okay? And we want to make sure that if we have excess capacity, we can use it to build our industries and grow our economy. Okay. Yes?
I think just a contribution. I mean, this is a free market foundation. sort of event, why would you have a problem with over excessive capacity when your costs are already now down? Because with overcapacity, it means you can actually bolster economic growth.
That's
in a
exactly
faster way.
the,
So
that's exactly the
the
point.
argument that there is overcapacity or we will sit with stranded assets, I mean, in energy is the most ridiculous to start with.
Yeah.
And I think we must dispel this view that when we already know that there is an energy poverty in South Africa, a person who dwells in a shed just across, 5 kilometers, you will find sheds, all right? In that space, a person has no capacity to grow their life because they are constrained on the basis of energy.
Yes.
You and I live what they call a middle class life. Okay, we have abundance of energy, and because of that, we can create wealth. People in the, Shanty Squatter area cannot create that wealth because they don't have energy. So I think we must be very clear from that point of view to say we must dispel this view that overabundance of energy causes a problem economically. There is no such.
Yeah.
All the countries that have built energy power stations that have even overcapacitated have done what we call industrialized, highly developed. You don't have such a problem in London because they're using that energy. Their cities are lit. Everything is functioning. Things are moving. So I think from that, and I don't hear that view coming out from the perspective of an economy point of view. We're talking energy with a perspective of saying only for experts. But we're not talking energy in enabling people's lives in terms of movement, mobility, and upward mobility in terms of wealth. Because there is a correlation between wealth and energy supply.
Absolutely.
You're 100% the wealthy people have abundance of energy to themselves. You can fly 20 times a day to wherever you want, and you can live a fabulous life.
Yeah.
Poor people cannot afford that because of energy.
Yes.
And now there is even this, sort of emergence of this crypto energy, economy, where if you don't have enough energy, you're not going to produce wealth.
Yeah.
And I think we should put that into perspective. So we must tell our policy makers, we must tell our decision makers that this concept that if you have more power stations, you are going to create a crisis is wrong and is false.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. What you need to do in that space is to make that electricity affordable to the people. The risk is if it's too expensive, that the people on the ground level, on grassroots level, cannot afford that electricity. And that's why we're saying that with planning ahead in future, you can build these plants because it's a big capital investment at the beginning. The price comes down over time. Inflation catches up quite quickly with it, like you've seen, how quickly it catches up. 7 years, 10 years, it catches up with this capital cost that you've invested. You could even start reducing the price at the beginning, indexing it, and deferring that to a later time, which will cost more interest, obviously. Yes?
Doctor, you're going to talk about pebble bed at all?
I can. If
I'd
you
like
want
you
me
to. Just a couple of thoughts there.
Sure, yeah?
To that, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I will talk a little bit about the pebble bed one. I actually have hundreds of slides of it, but not here. But we'll talk about it. Okay, so this is really what we want to achieve. And as you can see, these are the different IRP scenarios, which we should not be going for. Not one of them are right. Not a single one. Not the cheapest one, not the most expensive one. What they are trying to do here is to create energy poverty, okay, limit us and get us used to expensive electricity, like we see happening in Australia, happening in California, happening in Germany. That's expensive electricity. Sure, they can afford it. I don't think we can. So I reject this trajectory for electricity prices in its entirety. Okay, it's going to damage us badly.
Coal is in those. Coal is in the.
Well, coal will have a cheaper capital cost here, but it will increase faster. So this dip will not be as steep. So it will start off a lower base and then it will be flatter. Yes. Okay.
Then why was it proposed in the first place?
You've got me there. I don't know.
Sorry.
As I said, we've presented that. I've discussed this even with the modelers, with the planners, the guys who set up the IRP 2018. When I explained to them this problem, their words to me were, yeah, but how much of a difference is it going to make? It's easier to do the calculation by assuming inflation for everyone. And they said, how much? I said, it makes a big difference. They said, is it How big? Is it significant? Is it a little? Is it small? What is it? Okay? That was the argument we had. And then I decided to quantify it. It's the only way you can show it. And this is significant. This is not, it's not insignificant. So this is incorrect, in fact. Yes, I heard some.
So they don't know the facts of who modeled the IRP. That's
well,
what
it's,
I
I have to be very careful here. It's not a mistake, okay? There's an assumption, and the assumption is that all energy prices increase with inflation over time to make it easier, because then you work in 2018 money. That's the assumption you work with. That assumption causes these figures to be flat, okay? And also the other assumption is zero learning means that if you build a plant there, it's going to be there, that is going to be there. So they're all going to sit up here, and you're going to end up with that. Okay? So it's an assumption that causes a result which doesn't reflect the reality. But it's economical calculation. So it depends on what you put in.
To clear your question, the IRP was decided by 2 or 3 people. It was not a group of experts put together. It was not industry players. And that document which was produced is very problematic because it mirrors a thesis of another student elsewhere, which they literally brought in and literally tried to balance it. So we have a problem with the IRP itself as a document in the way it was posed, because it does not talk to sectors in terms of different fuel as well as energy providers. It talks to a one ambition, which is literally the transition into, the just transition model.
Yes.
Which is fine, but it does not address the core fundamentals of the industry. And that is why it's flawed in terms of its assumption and its modeling particularly.
Okay. Okay, last question, then I have to move on. Yes.
No, wait. You don't answer it now. But
okay.
My question is, to me, you've been too kind to the renewables by saying that they're even okay, because because of the availability factor.
Sure.
Nuclear is always available and it's cheaper. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot by even going that way at all. And we're hardly a country that can afford to shoot ourselves in the foot to be politically correct. And so, your argument, if it's correct, is which, you're persuasive, I'm agreeing with you, is losing the PR battle to the greenies, and we all want to be nice to the world and be politically correct, and we've got no money. We can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you're right. I'm very careful to say that specific energy source is better than the others, but we've got horses for courses here. Sure. Yeah. They teach the others at school. In any case, so I need to talk about something else, climate change, which is also a contentious subject. South Africa is committed to reducing CO2 emissions. We've signed it. We said we're going to reduce CO2 emissions. Can we do it? Okay. You can argue. My simple answer is, at the moment, as far as I can see, it doesn't matter what we do. Okay. Climate change is real. We see it. We can measure it. If it is due to human activities or not, doesn't matter. We see climate change happening. We see droughts becoming longer, deeper, and it's not changing. We see it internationally, everywhere. We see that the climate is changing, and we can argue it's due to our own activities, or we can argue it's a natural process. It really doesn't matter. Okay? That argument has become the focal point of people throwing mud at each other, which really is, we need to just live in the environment that we're in, and we need to adapt to that environment changing over time. Okay? The only way we can do that is with energy. Okay? It doesn't help in the Cape to build dams. You can build dams as many as you want if they're empty. If it's not raining, those dams will not fill up. Okay? So we need to use our energy sources to adapt to our environment changing. Okay? The argument between people who say, oh, you are a climate denier, or you're this or that, there's no argument. It's a fun argument to have. You can have it over a beer. It's not what we are facing in the world today. In the world today, we see that we need to adapt to a changing climate continuously. And it's never changed. It's always been like that. The climate change has always changed. So we need to adapt to that. And the only way we can do it is to to take away our reliance on our weather patterns and move it somewhere else. Koeberg nuclear power plant this year introduced a desalination plant. They took themselves completely off the Cape Town water grid, okay, by using waste heat energy to desalinate water. We see now in Egypt, they're building 4,000 megawatts of nuclear power with 2 desalination plants, the capacity of which can supply the entire water demand of the Western Cape. Those 2. They plan to terraform the Sahara Desert into farmlands, into agricultural farmlands. Okay? We need to start thinking about how do we live with the increasing population in the world, with an uncertain environmental conditions, and we need to solve it. Okay? And the only way we can do it is with energy. So not only is it poverty that you were talking about, but also our food security is reliant on energy security. We need energy. We need to start thinking differently about this. This is really important. But we need to also answer, are we actually solving the problem, the CO2 problem that everybody's talking about, if we do what everybody's saying? Because the moment I'm saying I'm against renewable power, the first argument is, yeah, but now what about the CO2 footprint? Now let's look at examples in the world. First one, France. This is just taken on a random day. France is sitting 96% low carbon, low CO2 emissions. They have a grid of 40 gigawatts of nuclear power installed, and they've got some others. Okay, their emissions 40 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced. Okay, Germany, we've already looked at Germany. They've got some nuclear, which they will switch off in 2022. There will be 0 nuclear in Germany. You have got coal over there, you've got wind and solar, and you can see the massive amounts that's been installed for these plants. I don't know if you can see them from there, but that is wind, that's the installed capacity, that's what it was producing at the time. Installed solar, what was it producing? Coal, and so on. They're sitting at 409 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Okay? So 10-fold increment. All right? On a country that is overflown with wind and solar. Denmark, the other one that people love to use, sitting at 212 grams. That's 5 times more. They're running predominantly on wind, and in this case, they were importing electricity from Norway. Okay? Norway, the greatest example of them all, 25 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Okay? They're running 100% renewables, okay, in the form of hydro. Okay? That is a wonderful situation to be in. Okay? No pollution, no gases being released. I don't know what the environmental impact is of those hydro plants, but I'm assuming they're managing it. But this is great. We don't have that luxury in South Africa. Okay? So if we are saying that it's about carbon or CO2 emissions that's important, this model is not working. Okay? But again, it doesn't really matter, because we need to start realizing that we need energy to live in a changing environment and to adapt to that changing environment. We're not going to change it back. Our activities is not going to help for that. There's a question there about.
I just want to clarify. One of the foolish suggestions to come out of our government has been to think that we can get power from the Grand Inga 4,000 kilometers away in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That is the most dumbest idea that they have come up with, because the physics just simply do not make sense, they do not allow. So we cannot be in the same space that Norway is in terms of being reliant on the Grand Inga, though meteorologically you can assume that there will always be rain, therefore you can rely on that water source. But the physics in terms of transmission, the longest transmission in the world today is in Russia. The Brazilians were trying to build what would have been the longest at 3,400 kilometers. It completely failed because of simply your transmission losses and also the capital costs. Now, in this case, what has never been answered is how do you transmit 4,000 kilometers in no man's land? Which air force are you going to get to guard those lines? When we couldn't protect a pylon right here in Indonesia. It was brought down in a few minutes with a few spanners. So 4,000 kilometers, how are you going to make sure that the transmission line doesn't run? The next, of course, which is Kawarabasa, is 1,000 kilometers. It's running on a direct current line into Babsfontein, next to my hometown of Tembisa. But that energy, by and large, we are transiting it for Namibia. We are not using it for ourselves. So when we look at all of these things, currently Eskom is emitting just under 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, whereas Germany, you've got the example being over 400. The question then that needs to be asked legitimately is that, do we have a CO2 problem if we agree, and I have to confess I'm a denialist, that CO2 does not cause climate change? But if we were to agree for a moment that CO2 does cause climate change, do we have a problem taking into account our installed capacity from coal? And can we make far-reaching decisions 50 years from now on where we have not worked out even the elementary arithmetic to give us 1 + 1 = 2?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think, just one moment, I just want to comment on that. I think the important thing here is to note is that the government is committed to reducing CO2 emissions. So they've committed to it. You can deny or you don't have to. They've committed to it. The question is, if you commit to it, is this your solution really? Because it's not working, number one. Okay? And then number two is, you could argue, is it going to help? Is it going to make a difference? But that's a different story. And I think nobody will deny the fact that we need to clean up our coal plants in any case. Pollution is not great, doesn't matter what type of pollution that is. Yes?
As commented the gentleman at the back triggered there, something which is important to bear in mind is the very original motivations for all of this. In the case of the wind and solar, it was brought about to get rid of fossil fuels because of the CO2. Nobody ever came up with the wind and solar in the beginning as a financially sensible alternative to coal. They didn't come and say this is best for the population, this is best for GDP growth or anything like that. They said let's get rid of fossil fuels and this is a way to go as a non-fossil fuel route. Also with nuclear, if you look right back at the beginning of anti-nuclear feelings, sometimes it was said, oh, it's dangerous, it's this, that, and the other. But if you dig deep into the original Greenpeace writings and many of those organizations, you'll find they said nuclear promised to be too cheap. And they were saying at the time, there's too many people on planet Earth, we're using up the resources, we're going to burn out the planet. For a long time they've been using the comment now that we're using 1.5 planets worth of resources already. This has got to be stopped. We've got to cut population growth, we've got to cut general GDP growth, otherwise we will overload. And one way they said was we can't allow electricity prices to keep dropping because it'll encourage people to make more car plants and to do more this, to more that. So there's a fundamental philosophy at the beginning. If you see the last number of days, there have been pictures coming back from the COP meeting in Poland. And the number of people that are holding posters up there saying no nuclear because it's good for the climate and this type of thing. This climate issue is the fundamental. And again, I'm one of the ones who does not believe that there's the man-made global warming. I don't think it's right, but it's politically a realistic thing. And in fact, South Africa, right on day one at COP21, when we agreed to the 34% reduction, it was then said South Africa will reduce by 34% CO2 on condition that all the other countries play their part. So there was a condition built into that. And others are not. Others already gone above it.
Yes.
So that's the philosophy is important, what motivated all.
Yeah, I think the important thing is we need energy to adapt to a changing environment in any case. And that is what we need to solve, because that change is not going to suddenly stop. Okay, and it's been happening. So,
Sorry,
okay, I can just let me.
Okay.
Are we running out of time? Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Okay, in Germany, you can even see it in France. In France, this CO2 emissions actually goes up when the wind starts blowing. It's an interesting scenario because then they ramp up the gas turbines. Okay, because the gas turbines need to stand and idle to solve the intermittency problem. Okay, so when the wind starts blowing, you replace some nuclear supply, a low CO2 emission supply, with another low CO2 emission supply, but you also start running the gas turbines to let them idle. Germany, they've opted, and this is purely a cost thing, to have the coal plants run in place of them. It's an interesting scenario, if when they shut down the nuclear in 2022, that will be replaced by either coal or gas. Nothing else, because at this point in time, those are fixed, what's available. So their CO2 emissions will then go up to about 600 grams per kilowatt hour. So they have got a big problem, and that's why they're missing their targets that they've set. And I mean, they still considered to be the leaders in the world, which for green technologies, which is a problem because it's not solving any problems. Okay, so let's talk about. I've again stepped into the trap of sounding anti-renewables, which I'm not. I think it's horses for courses, and I think we need a balanced mix, and I think we need energy security in this country. So what is a possible solution? Now, I've showed you at the beginning, you've got these these plants, coal plants, that is planned for and that will be available by 2030. Then we propose another about a third coming from new coal, new nuclear, okay, and as well as the IPPs, that's already there. The IPP bid window 1 to 4 is already there. We've stuck with that. It's costing us a lot of money, but it's going to be there. And then this third over here is the 30% that I'm saying we could leave open for other energy sources like solar, wind, gas mix, and everything else. And even maybe a pebble bed modular reactor coming in there, okay, which is very nice to supply those peaks. Okay, this is a much more rational approach, in my view, and you could differ, than replacing all of that, 2/3 of the supply, with a mix of wind, solar, and gas. We have seen that it has internationally never been done that you get wind and solar penetration of more than 30% in any country, anywhere. Okay, not even in Germany. So it would be irrational to plan that you replace 2/3 of our supply with that mix. It just doesn't make sense. You need some other sources, and that would be your baseload sources, your conventional baseload sources, and we need to plan ahead. We cannot just go ahead and do everything and not plan with the future, but you have seen the possibilities today of what that can look like. This could be argued. You could make this smaller, and I'm sure a lot of people would make this even smaller. I'm saying let's push for that 30%. If we can get that, that would be great. I'm not sure if we can get it. Okay? That is the rational solution, in my view. Thank you very much.
Just one question. Do you want to go straight on now, or should we take questions?
I don't need to go at all. I'll just walk in darkness.
Doctor, could you elaborate a little bit more on pebble bed? Why was it stopped, I think, in 2008, and what are its pros and cons, and just your views generally on it?
Okay. Look, in 2008, actually it was, I think, earlier, late 2009, it was officially stopped. I cannot tell you the exact answer why it fell out of favor politically at that stage, and there was some technological issues around the governance of it was not a technical problem. It dragged on for a long time, and it didn't get to the commercialization process, and basically people got tired of this slow moving forward, or the politicians. Is it the comment on the question, or is it a...
Yes.
Okay.
I was the last person to do an economic impact study on the PVMR, and I recommended, I'm the ex-MD of Econometrics, and it was a brilliant idea from an economic point of view. My report was very clear that we had a chance and opportunity to lead the world in this technology, and within 9 months the government canned it. I had heard that it was partially not so much a technical problem, but they had followed a more expensive route, and it was a little bit more complicated than they anticipated, and therefore the money became rather great. But why they actually canned it, I can't really say. It should never have been canned.
Yeah. I just want to continue on that. So there was a report that came from McKinsey in 2004 that did a techno-economic study on that I have got access to, which calculated the cost per kilowatt hour, the levelized cost of electricity at around 2.4 US cents per kilowatt hour at that stage. Now with inflation, that would have gone up a bit, but I mean it's extremely economically viable. But it didn't look like there was an end point to it, so it was canned. About 2 years ago, we restarted the project as an R&D project. Not many people are aware of it. We got some money from the Eskom R&D department to look at it, just to see what would be the nuclear options of the future. And we re-looked at the technology behind it quite a bit to see what is available that wasn't available 10 years ago. And we did include things like we were talking molten salt heat storage, heat storage applications to increase the efficiency of the plant, because the plant can then run 100% all the time, store the heat in these heat stores, and then go and be flexible on a grid. So it added flexible supply. We have tested in the last 2 years, we have tested the pebbles that was made on the previous pebble bed reactor. The kernels. We've sent it to the Idaho National Labs in the US to put it through a full burn-up cycle, to put it in an oven, and we've tested it now up to 1,800 degrees Celsius. And it shows us that it verifies all the models of how these kernels are supposed to function. So up to 1,600 degrees Celsius, as you expect, there's no releases whatsoever from those. So we're seeing a lot of benefits from that, and I think that is, we're looking at a 50 megawatt plant now. I think it's definitely the future. SMRs are the future of nuclear power. Yes, there at the back. Sorry, before you. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. We have just to be cautious, okay? Because we are speaking about modular reactors since 30 years. We are speaking about high temperature reactors since 30 years. And people are not stupid in other countries, okay? Yeah. If it's not coming, it's because it's not so easy, okay? Since I am born, approximately I am hearing thorium is the solution for reactor nuclear. I hear thorium since 40 years. I have never seen a thorium reactor. So I mean, I think it's a very good idea to continue to study because it's bringing knowledge to the country. Now ask you a question all the time. When people are not building such type of reactor in the world, what is the problem? Okay? I think it was a very good idea, the PBMR for Sasol, okay, because we need heat. If we want to produce hydrogen in the future, it's certainly a very good idea, because producing electricity for a battery with coal is a nonsense, okay? If we need to produce electricity for the battery, we need something clean. If we need to produce hydrogen, we can use the heat or the pebble bed and so on. But first, ask us a good question why the other one are not jumping on the system.
Thank you, yes. Yeah, there's 2 questions from you.
Doctor, I was just going to ask, is pebble bed less dangerous from a nuclear waste perspective? Okay. Because that's still a problem, I understand, with your bed.
Look, you're asking the wrong person about if waste is a problem. I see waste as a massive benefit. It's the only technology which the volumes of the waste is extremely small. Okay, all Kuberg's waste of the last 30 years fits on half a tennis court. All the waste. Okay, if you look at any other plant, the waste of a coal plant it's just not comparable. The waste of a PV solar plant, those panels that last for 20 years and then there's some products that come off, the volumes are more and they don't decay away, by the way. Nuclear stuff, it takes a while. So I'm the wrong person to ask. But the volumes are extremely small. It needs to be managed, of course. It goes into these concrete casks. The benefit of the pebbles is that the pebbles are already encapsulated in these what we call triso-coated layers, which is carbon and silicon carbide layers on the particles, and then it goes into a graphite pebble. It increases the volume quite a bit, okay? But it's already encased in a shell that prevents gases and things from leaking out. So it'll still go into a shielded canister, but it's safer, yeah.
Just a quick question. I think I didn't see the Paris Climate Agreement. which is really pushing the canning of whatever is not seen as alternative, green or renewable. And yet, I mean, it's stronger evidence coming out that actually nuclear is the most cleanest. And yet you're not playing the renewable space. You're not claiming the value of what nuclear can do. And not only that, what is being proposed in the Paris climate, I mean, they're meeting right now in Poland, okay? They have a working plan for countries. So whatever you, I, and a few people are going to decide, they are not going to really listen at all. Because the plan is UN-based, it's going to be imposed on countries, and based on that, they're just going to do as they wish, unless there's a strong resistance. How come is the nuclear sector silent? I mean,
look, I think it's dual because nuclear has never been in the space of saying we are there because we want to prevent CO2 in the first place. Last year, I attended the Sustainable Energy for All Forum in New York City. It's a forum that's for sustainable energy. And I got there, and I was the only nuclear person there, okay? The only nuclear person. I went around and I spoke to people. During that entire 4 days conference, the CO2 reductions that has been achieved has not been put up on a single slide for that 4 days. Not at all. That is not the measurement of success in that space. The measurement of success in that space is how much renewable energy have you installed so far. And then the answer is not enough. You need to install more because we haven't reached our targets yet. You feel in that space it was mostly bankers and people in the economic sector. But I went around, I said, listen, why are you not showing these graphs? Why aren't you showing what have you achieved? You've installed all of this, but have you achieved something? The measure of success is how much have you installed. And then you think, okay, now secondary, it's going to achieve something. So nuclear is not in that space at all. It's not in the space of saying we are seeing how much we can install as quickly as possible. And I don't think it should be. I think it's all about installing horses for courses, installing a clean energy source, and with everything we do, cleaning it up, and being environmentally, what is the word? Disciplined and taking responsibility for what we're doing. And that's with all energy sources. So maybe we could play that card, but I'm not sure if I will feel great about that. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the discussion. So I'm in the solar industry, and yet I don't disagree at all with your recommended alternative mix that you put forward. What does concern me, though, is, especially with nuclear, is the concentration of procurement spend in the arms of Eskom and in government. And it concerns me on two fronts. The one is obviously what we've seen with Medupi and Cilliers, that you are likely to take twice as long and cost twice as much as what you put on paper, right? So, in the words of Johan Rupert, it looks good on paper, but the game is played on grass. So, converting that into the real world, into practicalities, is probably going to be twice as expensive as we planned. The second concern, and perhaps bigger concern, is the R1 trillion procurement spend is a massive corruption concern. So you're talking about 30 times the arms deal in terms of quantum of upfront spend. And I don't think as a country we can afford a new layer of corruption and on the scale that we've seen it. So, what I like about the IPP process is you are fragmenting supply into the hands of private sector, where the incentive is produce as cost effectively and as efficiently as possible. Is there, you can't have a private sector nuclear to the same fragmented degree, but is there a balance that protects those risks in the nuclear rollout?
Look, and what I'm glad about, you're not addressing, it's not a technology issue. Nuclear probably fits into a specific space because of its size and its complexity. So there will always be a state involvement in nuclear, which is something that we need to work through. I think everybody in this room and everybody in this country are concerned about corruption, and that is what we need to address. Okay, we need to address the corruption problem. I do not think that the private sector is immune to corruption at all. In fact, if you fragment it, it's just a lot more smaller pieces that you can siphon off money, and it's more difficult to detect. If it's one big one, although we've seen in this country that you can do big ones without it being picked up. But if it's one big one, it's probably you can put a spotlight on it and you can do it. But then you have to put your all your processes in place to look at that. You need a spotlight on these things. You cannot trust anybody put into a position of power to make decisions that nobody will be incorruptible. You will find them everywhere. But then again, like I said, I don't think the private sector is immune to it. I don't think the private sector is immune to also lobby government and pay money under the table to get deals and things like that. I'm not saying it's happening. I'm saying do not think this is only for one specific technology. On the other hand, I think a public-private partnership in the nuclear space is not too far-fetched. Okay, we have seen that, and I've run a few models which I haven't shown here, where you can get actually public money at a much lower rate than that 8.2%. Okay, so you can have a 70% or a 60% of your asset being funded publicly with a much lower rate, at 3% or something like that, and then your private sector can have an increased return on investment. So if you combine that, you can actually get the prices lower than the ones I've shown you, and it will also put a lot of checks and balances into that process. So we should stop thinking that this is the way it's done and that's how it always should be done. If we know we want a specific solution for the country, we should go and create that solution. There's nothing that prevents us from doing that. Okay, so and in Finland they've done that. In Finland they're building nuclear plants now with a public-private partnership agreement, and you can get that money. You don't have to wait 60 years to get it back. You can do it over 20 years, and then the other 40 years is basically making money. So there's many models that can work. But if you don't want that model to work, I can assure you will make it fail. So that's the problem we sit in this country. We don't agree on where we want to go, and we try to put obstacles in front of each other's ways. So I'm going for solar, absolutely, but it would be irrational to think that you're going to run the country on solar. So yeah, that. Oh, sorry, Calvin was. Okay, Dr. Kemp.
It's invalid to talk about the corruption angle as if it's unique to nuclear. There's no more reason why nuclear would have corruption involved than with solar and wind. And there was no indication of corruption in nuclear. It was just said that it's likely to happen. It's also not valid to say there's going to be a natural cost overrun in the projects. Coburg was built on time and on budget. Overruns that have been here because of been political interference and people falling over their own feet has got nothing to do with the competence of building the power stations. I've heard all sorts of horror stories that come from Medupi and Cilliers and so on, and they're all organizational confusion type issues that are politically linked. It isn't that there's anything about the engineering that's the snag. We did it before. When Coburg was built as well, it was essentially built by South Africans. If you went around there on any given day, I wasn't there, it was before my time, but I know people who were there. The people driving the trucks, putting the concrete, they were South Africans. You didn't find French people or German people or something there. Yes, they were the design engineers involved with our design engineers to ensure that the thing unfolded in the right path. But this image somehow that we're going to write out one check once and post it to one foreign country, then sit on the hill with a pair of binoculars when they arrive and they build the power station is wrong. It'll be our people that do all the work. Then, completely I agree with you about there's no reason why there shouldn't be private involvement. As far as I'm concerned, nuclear already has massive private involvement because when the power station is built, it's not the government building the power station. It'll be the Murray and Robertses of this world and the Group 5. It'll be 300 or 400 companies. There's those sorts of numbers, private companies that all should be contracted like they would be contracted when you build a hotel or anything. You put in your bid and you get paid for doing the job on time, for pouring the concrete and so on. So the entire thing is actually privately built in the sense that the people doing the work are all private companies down the line. And one final comment with the pebble bed, just out of interest to people, when the government pebble bed project was officially stopped, a private group continued and they redesigned the pebble bed to some degree to make a somewhat simpler cheaper version, and that went along quite far. That exists now in a form that can be moved towards construction, and it's entirely privately owned. So that right today is in private hands. In China, the Chinese have just built a pebble bed type reactor very similar to ours. Then I think it was April this year, the Russians launched a small modular reactor on a ship, a floating reactor that you can ride to where you wanted to go. I spoke to them about it, and they said the idea came from South Africa. That's where they got the idea from here to do that. And so the idea of these small modular type reactors of pebble bed style and other types of styles are going to come. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And if we'd stuck with it, we'd had the courage of our convictions at pebble bed time, we'd probably be selling pebble beds around the world today.
Okay, there and then at the back. Yeah.
So I'd just like to make a comment. I was actually on the site with Kuwak, and I know that it was of a cost, but that was not my comment. I'm a bit concerned, though. We all know that it's all very well to make these theoretical assumptions about cost, etc. But the problem that I think you assume, I know tomorrow if I go to a bank, I can finance solar, and I can finance wind. I'm starting to finance coal at the moment. I'm not aware, unless the government will explicitly guarantee the debt, that I'm going to get any private money for nuclear. And there's very few examples. If you take in places like the US, they're closing nuclear plants at the moment in favor of solar in California.
No. Okay, so first of all, you're right. And it's a banking system. We live in a banking system, and like I said earlier, if you go to the Sustainable Energy for All Forum, you sit there with bankers. Okay, they love to fund these projects. Why do they love to fund wind and solar? Because it's 100% guaranteed by government. It's the highest class of debt that you can take. It's prime quality debt because you cannot default on that debt. What a lot of people are doing, IPPs, and maybe you might be aware of some of those, they go for the power purchase agreements. Once you get the deal, you sell off those companies to the banks. Banks own half of these nowadays because it's great assets to have for them. Okay, this is not the real world that we're working in. This is bubbles that's building up, and we see how the financial sector build those bubbles. They build it all the time. We've seen the one burst in 2008. Okay, with financing things that cannot crash because it's got sovereign backing. That's really risky stuff for the world, not for the guy who's financing. Okay, so we need to make a careful decision on how we go about that. But for nuclear, we can probably do the same. There's a few international money funds that will not fund nuclear for whatever reasons. Okay, they believe it's unsafe or whatever, just like they would say they won't fund coal because of its dirtiness and so on. We need to change that perception. If we want to solve the world's problems, we need to change that perception. And it's not an easy solution. But I'm not one to go for easy solutions necessarily. I want to go for the right one. But if it's about money, all the way, I would invest into the IPPs and solar and wind if it was about money for me. Really? Yes?
To answer two comments. The first comment is to understand why people are requesting a sovereign guarantee. It's not to cover the cost of the plant. It's just to cover one thing, is that as we are living almost in the world, except in some country, in a democratic world, a change of government can stop a nuclear plant. That means it's the only reason why the vendors are requesting a state guarantee to not to be sure that one new government will not stop it. Okay? It's not for the funding. The funding is done by the bankers, and at a rate which is certainly closer to 3% or 3.5% today, flat, compared to the other one. Okay? I mean, it's not a problem to finance a nuclear plant. It's even easier. I am very surprised when I see a contract signed in IPP, and it takes X years for the closing, for the financial closing. I can tell you I did a financial closing for a nuclear plant. I can do it in less than 4 months. Okay?
Thank you. Okay, there and then there. Yeah. Mr. in the middle.
Okay. A fundamental assumption that we have in the solar and the wind space is that we're going to augment it with gas. This country has no gas. And Sasol's gas is going to run out in about 10 years' time. And to bring a gas supply into the country is going to make the cost of electricity very expensive.
You're right.
So if you use the Henry Hub number plus double it to get it here, you're getting per kilowatt hour probably about the same order of R1.20 a kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental assumption. They can't flex the solar and the wind without the
flexible
of the gas.
Yes.
That's what they've assumed.
Yeah. So just on that point, I think there was a comment made that they're closing nuclear plants in the US in favor of wind and solar. They're not. They're closing it in favor of shale gas, okay, with the wind and solar connected to it. Shale gas in the US is rock bottom prices. It's extremely cheap. It is an isolated continent where it's happening, where the shale gas, where they have so much supply of shale gas, and they have that for the next 100 years, where nothing really can compete. Okay, but yeah, and so that's what they're doing. So now there's a lot of people on the wind and solar bandwagon saying they're closing the nuclear plants in favor of the renewables. It's not. It's for the gas, and they're building the gas and solar to reduce their CO2 emissions from the gas when it's available. So that's really important. Other countries, we don't see that scenario. In Australia today, they're running on solar, wind and gas, and it's cheaper for them today. I've spoken to some of them. It's cheaper for them today to install a diesel generator in your home and run off that than to run off the grid because of the gas prices that they're facing. So we have a real concern. We might find an abundance of shale gas in the Karoo. I don't know about the environment, how it's going to be. I'm saying we might find it and it will change the whole scenario. But for today, as it is today, we will sit in the same scenario as what Australia is sitting if we follow this IRP route. And that is not been quantified, so I don't know where the least cost calculations is coming from to get to the cost, because the cost of gas for us has not been quantified. Yes?
My question is, from a Green's point of view, in the nuclear fallout, in the also in building the power station, the area around the power stations for farming, is it viable? And the water, where does it take harmful items out to sea? Can you answer those?
Simple answer. Nuclear power plants got the smaller footprint per kilowatt hour produced of any other energy source. So the part of the environment, the part of land that you need is extremely small. Okay, if you put any other energy source up, it's going to be bigger. Okay, the footprint itself, the area around the power station is not affected. Okay, there's no radiation coming out, shining at you, or gases being released. There's nothing coming out of a nuclear power plant. Okay, Koeberg has got the most wonderful nature reserve that's sitting around it. If you drive on that site, there's springbok and zebra and things like that walking around. There's hiking routes. So it's from our environmental point of view, and it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. It's wonderful from an environmental point of view. Concerning the water supply, it's got 3 loops. Okay, so the primary water circuit is the circuit that is in touch with the nuclear fuel itself. Okay, and that could be considered that there could be contaminants and things like that in there. That is a sealed cycle. Okay, then you've got a secondary loop. That's your steam loop. That's the one that produces the steam that runs the turbine. And that's also a closed loop. Okay, so you've got some tanks and things like that to supply water and take water off. But all of that is sealed loops. And then you've got a tertiary loop, a third loop, which is used to cool the steam water off. Okay, and that comes from the ocean. But that's not in touch with any nuclear part at all. So it's clean water. Okay, there might be some chemicals in to kill off bacteria or something like that, but it's not. There's no nuclear in touch with the water. So people are saying, oh, but they're putting radioactive water into the ocean. It's not the case. It's not the case at all. So there's a shielding of 3 loops in between. Okay. So yeah, environmentally it's great. One question there, and then only in the back, and then. Okay. Okay, in front here.
Yes. Just make a quick question on capital and availability of capital.
Yeah.
We raised the issue of funding a JV between state as well as private consortium that can go into nuclear. Yes, there is a huge issue whereby nobody is prepared to talk about the financing of a nuclear if it is not state-owned.
Yeah.
Secondary to it is banks have released a moratorium whereby they said that they are not going to fund anything that is non-renewable. So coal is already been now blacklisted.
Yeah.
There's no projects that's going to come out. What are the alternative funding sources whereby people are looking for this kind of, projects that can come up and can actually do economic development? And the fact that there is a moratorium, what has the industry done to challenge this particular moratorium from the banks? Because remember, banks are a monopoly on their own. If they release a moratorium, all of them, and saying literally as a cartel, we're not going to give you money.
Yeah.
It means that they've actually blocked economic development. How are we going to challenge this when there is no voice that is challenging the particular instrument?
It's a difficult one. At the moment, you're talking about state sovereign loans. So you're looking at countries, the vendor countries that would supply the loans. And then that also then starts to limit your numbers. You probably can have China as a vendor country. You can have Russia as a vendor country. Maybe Korea. I'm not sure if the US is in that business where they will fund it at a certain. So and maybe Japan as well. Japan has got, with their deflation, they really want to give you the money at the moment to keep it until because your money will grow faster than it will grow it will just lose value in their country. So, but it's all sovereign-backed loans that you will get for these plants. But that's possible, and that's how most of them work. But you're right, with the banks, it looks like it's taken some time, but it looks like there is a movement to say that, listen, nuclear energy will be part of the mix, and it has to be part of the mix into the future if we're going to actually produce the amount of electricity that we need to. And then it will take time for these financial institutions to catch up with that. But that's the job that we have, to make sure that information goes out. And we need more people who can fight that battle. Okay, they're right at the back. And then I think we're done.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Cilliers, but I said I wanted to try and make 2 points. Okay. The first one is you cannot compare electricity that is produced for 20 years only with something which is 60 years and or 40 years in the case of coal, and where one's producing it, say, 35% and the other's producing it theoretically 80 or 90%. And in fact, if you run the measurements over the life and take those factors into account, coal and nuclear work out at probably half the capital cost of the renewables. Now, people have, when I put that equation in, they said, oh, well, you didn't do DCF. Well, hang on, you've got to replace your plant after 20 years, and it will cost more because it's going to be an inflated cost. And then, in the case of if you're competing with nuclear, you've got to do it twice, at 20 years and 40 years.
Yes, correct.
And actually, if you do the DCF again, it's not a lot different. But definitely, it's still much cheaper. You ran through quite a few of the costs that were additional, but there are actually about 5 that are added to renewables, apart from additional backup costs. The fact that they deliver electricity when not required, and all these other problems. But there's one cost that is not worked out in all their models, and that is what you'd call an economic risk cost. Because I'm afraid a model works on certainty. In other words, when the wind starts blowing, boy, there's something to replace it. The real world doesn't work like that, particularly when you get 2 weeks without sun and wind. There's an economic risk cost. And in fact, you can work it out. It works out at about R1.30 for nuclear and about R2 for coal, which at least for renewables. So renewables work out to be significantly more expensive. I just could make another point, which is on climate change, on which I've done a lot of work. If you examine Russia, Poland, India, China, the Asian countries, they talk, the climate change talk, but they take no notice of it themselves. They are producing fossil fuels and nuclear on a major scale. And in fact, South Africa only produces 1% of the world's so-called greenhouse gases. And if you study the science, you'll find CO2 is very good for the world. The best thing that's happening is it's actually greening the world. But that's another story. I am a skeptic and denialist.
Okay. Yeah.
Now this man's been waiting for a long time.
Yeah, it seems I'm being ignored.
Okay,
So
now
can I get crash?
Okay, go. Yeah. So why not?
Okay, let me get crash. Yeah, so I thought you were deliberately ignoring me. So, but that's fair enough. I'm Ronald Chauke from Outer. I will start quickly by throwing the gauntlet to the Freedom Market Foundation. The inputs which are being done here, will they be sent to the DOE? Because when we did the parliamentary session, they said that the commentary process is allowed to filter until, let's say, early next year, February or so, because even civil society was complaining about the complexity of the IRP, that other ordinary stakeholders couldn't comment on it because they said that they need more time to unpack it. I don't know, you will clarify that, whether these inputs will be sent to the DOE. And then my, what you call PBMR colleagues, sorry, I was one of the guys who shut PBMR. It was a financial decision. Just to give you a quick sense of why did we have to do it. We invited the GPE and then the PBMR executives. We worked hand in hand with them, and then we asked actually PBMR to help us understand when are we going to the commercial stage of the project. And then they were having a challenge to clarify that. So we explained to them that from the budget management point of view, we were struggling actually to keep it afloat. So they had to make a judgment call, of which at the end we made a proposal, we submitted to the executives, and then the executives said that since 12 PBMR executives and DPE couldn't present what you call a compelling case, unfortunately, the tab was closed. The same happened to EDI Holdings. I was one of the guys as well. So, but let's pass through that. So now what I want to quickly emphasize is that now what we need is the role of nuclear to be clarified actually in the future energy mix. That issue we asked the DOE to say that post-2030, will nuclear be given actually a reasonable component for it to play its role onwards? That question, DOE said that they will consider it, and then they will make sure that post-2030, when they do the revision of a new IRP, they are likely to take that into account. So we said that, no, that's fantastic. So, and then lastly, in my own submission of what is happening here, I believe that Leon is quite a good initiative. We need more of it. However, we must find a way of how actually to make sure that we engage the decision makers. Because some of the things which we are talking about here, you find that the planners in the DOE, they don't have the capability to even comprehend what we're talking about. So how do we expect them actually to filter that into their final product? So we have to find a way of how actually to infusion or, get our input, filtered into the whole process. And then lastly, we support the initiative. Thank you.
I just want to comment on, thank you very much. It's great that we see a plan that goes to 2030 and then beyond there's a little bit of uncertainty. The problem that we face is we need to start planning now. We cannot wait until 2030 or even 2025 and make a decision by then, and then it's too late. The reason we have load shedding today is, and it's a pun here, but it's because we won't let the sun shine on the other one in this country. We are fighting amongst ourselves on each one wanting his piece of the pie, but not wanting the other one to get his piece of the pie. And that is really problematic for me. So we need to get to a point where we say, listen, we are all in this space. We have industries, we have a coal industry, we've got a nuclear industry, we've got a renewable energy industry, which we actually want to grow. Let's just go ahead and go and do these things. Yeah, and then Des. And yeah.
From Moyo, I think they say if you want a sense of the future, always consider the past. And if you take a country like South Korea, just after the war that they had over there, it was a highly impoverished country with a lot of people without work, and they made a decision to go with nuclear and with coal. And I think that really sustained their whole industrial revolution that they were able to achieve. And I think we need something similar in South Africa. We need to create jobs. That's very important, and we need cheap power. And I think South Korea proved that that was a viable option for them.
Yeah. Today we all see Korean cars and electronics and everything. It was always the Japanese. Today it's the Koreans who are making all those things on the back of electricity, which they don't have the resources for. Jane, you want to?
Yeah, one more question.
There's.
And then we're going to.
I'm from the nuclear construction and industrialization sector, and I get very excited when I hear about the trillion rand. I would love to get paid R1 trillion for 10 gigawatts, but unfortunately not in my lifetime. What's important is to, and I'm surprised that we're even talking about this R1 trillion still in 2018. This is something that came back in, when did this start? And nobody knows where this number came from, but probably around 2014 or 12.
2010 DOE.
DOE, okay. So nobody knows the origin of this number, but it's been bandied around for the last 8 years. The reality is a little different. We're probably looking at closer to half that amount of money to build 10 gigawatts. When one also looks at a fleet, the benefits, and nobody talks around the benefits of a fleet. We talk about how the price of renewables has come down. Do you know that if you go and build 10 gigawatts of nuclear, the price of the first unit and the price of the last unit is a 40% difference in the cost of building those plants? Those are benefits that nobody talks about. We always talk about the single numbers, the old Toyota 3 plants that are built, the first of a kind, generation 3 technologies. That's the benchmark, and that's the future for nuclear. That is really not putting it into actual perspective. Then also looking then at another opportunity which we completely miss. The first 2 units that we're going to be building in South Africa is going to be next door to Kuburg as a brownfields project. The cost, the infrastructure costs, the sunken costs in that site already will reduce again the cost of the first 2 units. It's an enormous reduction on cost. You have the capabilities, you have an operating nuclear power plant next door, you've got all the expertise and knowledge over there, you have an industry that's over there. We need to recognize what the actual costs are going to be. The only way we are going to get to this is to validate the actual cost of nuclear through a proper tendering process. We have been prohibited as the nuclear industry to actually present our numbers. It was in the RFI available to be unpacked, and 3 days later somebody went and stopped it. And why should South Africa not know what was in that RFI? What shouldn't we know that is there? And why was it hidden? Why have you been prevented to know what's in that RFI? Because that's the truth. And that's the truth of what nuclear is going to cost you.
It will stop the debate immediately.
It will stop that debate, because while those numbers are not unpacked, this R1 trillion number just sits out there and is bandied around. And most of the people would believe it because, you know, hey, nuclear is expensive, of course. But these are the things that we need to actually deal with. Thank you.
What's your dollar cost per kilowatt?
Five.
Your estimate?
5.
So same to what he has there.
That is, yes, localized, and I'm talking about localization. In a fleet, you'll probably start about 35 to 40% localization on the first 2 units and build up to about 55% on the last 2 units of a 10 gigawatt fleet. Localization is a great important aspect of it. You also got the technology transfer. Tell me which developer that owns a renewable energy plant that owns that technology. He doesn't. You know, you get that technology transferred to the industry, to the owner operator and so forth. Not the IP, the technology transfer, the know-how and experience. And that's great for this country, for the future and the jobs creation.
Thank you very much.
Great.
On that point, I'm going to ask Leon Foundation Executive Director to make some closing comments. And then I'm sure there's still a lot of questions, and I think Dr. Cilliers is going to be around for a little while. So you can come and speak to him personally. Thank you, Leon.
Well, thanks. I did have my own full formal PowerPoint presentation, which I will not be making. So I'm going to make a few other comments. Firstly, I'm delighted by the mix we have in the room. We have what some people might call the 2 extremes and lots of other people in between. And I'm proud of that. I think as the Free Market Foundation, that's what we'd like to see. We are for, as Jane said at the beginning,
not any particular technology, but what we are for is a level playing field. We want the same rules for all. So that, for example, if a coal power station is required to provide dispatchable energy, constant, reliable supply, then precisely the same must be true, for example, of a solar or wind or hydro, and it must do it at its expense. The thing that I have a problem with personally, and I don't speak for the foundation here, and my comments from this moment on are me personally, and I'll explain why, is that what seems to me now to be happening is the government is, it is said, privatizing with IPPs. This is quite the wrong word. It's outsourcing, not even outsourcing, it's procuring. And the deal is something like this. It's like the government procuring a car from Toyota or Nissan or Merck or somebody. And this car is an unusual car. It goes and stops as it wishes. It goes at whatever speed it wishes. And if you're traveling in this car, then you have to have backup transport following you wherever you go in case the car just stops suddenly somewhere or starts going slowly. And if this car stops and then starts going, you have to jump in. You have to use it when it goes. You have no choice, regardless of whether you want to go anywhere. Now, this is a strange way to procure transport. The government wouldn't procure that sort of transport, but it procures that sort of energy, which is precisely what the IPB deals amount to. It's a strange kind of car that you buy that goes and stops when it wishes at whatever speed it wishes, and you have to pay for it when it happens to be going, whether or not you want to go anywhere. That's the problem. So we're just saying we don't need a debate about whether to have gas backup or whether to have coal or any other backup or hydro. That must be the decision made by the IPP provider. The IPP provider must decide however they are going to go about providing, and they can do it jointly, by the way. I think our competition policy should be reviewed here, because if people do collaborate, then it's called collusion, which is quite wrong. There should be joint ventures, and collusion in this case would be an appropriate way for IPPs to deal with their unreliable and irregular flow of service. The second point I want to make is that I have, on the question that has arisen here, nuclear safety. This has nothing to do with the Free Market Foundation. I was fascinated after Fukushima that people in the nuclear industry, some of them are in this room, started talking about the lessons they have learned from Fukushima. And as a result of that, they now make safer nuclear power stations that are third generation, and they are even better than they were before. And I had a very strange, curious response to this. Surely the lesson that they should have learned from Fukushima was that nuclear power is a lot safer than they thought. In fact, the nuclear physicists, one of whom I'm now looking at, have been lying to us and telling us that nuclear is dangerous and should be safe. It was never dangerous in the first place. And so what Fukushima taught us is that you can take an old, about to be decommissioned, first-generation power station, throw everything at it nature can think of, earthquakes, tsunamis, let everything break down, have meltdowns, and how many people died of radiation or even got sick? 0. And what was interesting to me was, what happened to the animals and the plants? So I did some research into what happened to all this billions of liters of highly irradiated water being pumped into the sea of Fukushima. And what happened is no visible mutations appeared in the animals. A few that could be measured by zoologists appeared, and they all disappeared by the second or third generation. There were no longer any mutations left. So I thought, well, what happened at Chernobyl? And I looked into that too. It turned out the same thing. And if you think about it, right in the Chernobyl plant, from day one, there were bunnies and lizards and birds and rats and mice and insects all living right literally in the reactor building. And what happened to them? Well, the same thing. No visible mutations, not extra eyes or legs or anything like that. Slightly longer feathers maybe on a bird that had a nest right there next to the reactor core, that all again disappeared within 2 or 3 generations. Apart from that, there were the babushkas, women who refused to move, mainly women who refused to move, who simply stayed there in the village right around outside the reactor. What happened to them? Well, they have lower incidence of cancer from radiation risk than the general population. So what is clear, and this is the point that I've produced in a paper which was internationally presented 3 weeks ago, and I'm happy to email anyone the full paper, on the safety of nuclear. And there is a kind of weird myth that gripped the nuclear industry called LNT, linear non-threshold hypothesis. And the long story cut short is it basically says that any amount of radiation is dangerous. And this is the basis on which all of the safety, when you go and have your teeth x-rayed or you go for an x-ray, I'm going in for a hip replacement next week, and I've had x-rays for that. And all of the security and safety they have around x-rays is based on the LNT hypothesis, which is clearly nonsense. It's quite amazing, and I'm happy to send anyone who wants the actual full paper on nuclear safety about that. And so nuclear is extraordinarily safe, and it is the safest of all the forms of energy by a very, very big margin. It's not even subject to informed debate. It's a margin so big that it's hard to comprehend. And so, for example, you know, it is assumed that hydro is safe or nuclear is safe. Well, no, there are casualties and fatalities in the construction and the mining of the materials and the building and the maintenance and so on. So you can look at all of the forms of energy and see which ones of them have the different levels of casualty and fatality. And by far the lowest is nuclear. Next lowest, if you deduct one big dam burst, would be hydro. And below that, much, much higher, much more dangerous than nuclear is wind and solar, and coal as the most dangerous. The final point I want to make is that, just by the way, we in South Africa, Eskom, and I spoke to the scientists and physicists responsible, introduced new safety measures at Koeberg from the lessons we learned from Fukushima. Now, whenever you hear that phrase, I want you to know you're hearing nonsense. It's twaddle. The only lesson from Fukushima is that nuclear is safer than anyone ever realized. So what they did is they spent, I could round it, I mean it's a few 100 million rand, but let's just, to make it a nice round number, call it a billion, to make Koeberg safer. So I asked the people who made the decision, how many lives will this save? How many lives are going to be saved as a result of Koeberg being safer for, let's say, R1 billion? And the answer was, they did work it out. Something like one life in probably well over 1 million years will have been saved. At best, that's the most optimistic assumption. It's probably more like 1 billion years. So I said, now, if that billion had been given to a pediatric unit in a hospital, how many babies' lives would have been saved? I asked a civil engineer, a road engineer, who I don't see her now, I might have attended, works for one of the biggest civil engineering companies in the country, to ask his colleagues, if I gave you R1 billion, how many lives could you save by making roads safer? And they asked people's opinions, not a scientific research, just cast around with road engineers, and they said probably about 14 lives per year. Not 1 per million, 14 per year. So if you'd spent that money on more policing, how many rapes and murders could have been saved? So what we've done in the so-called name of nuclear safety is we have spent money for no benefit at all that could have saved many, many lives over a period of years, hundreds. Those lives, so when you hear about a rape or a murder or a fatal car accident, please say to yourself, that money was spent for no human benefit or animal or natural benefit at Koeberg. Wasted. So, that led me to the following question. If we produce nuclear at the same safety level as, for example, wind or solar or hydro, we say it's level playing field. Let's all have the same safety standards. What would you lower nuclear safety to put it on a par with, for example, wind? The number of people who fall off ladders and get killed mining and injuries in factories making it and transporting and maintenance and so on and so forth. And the answer was that if you lowered nuclear safety by something like 50% below first generation safety, not third generation, you would save something like 90% of the cost. So in other words, if you treat all the energy sources the same from a safety point of view, nuclear would be cheaper by a spectacular margin. Just completely knock the others out of the water completely. The final point is this, that on the question of climate change, there's some difference in the room as to whether it's real or not, and whether it's anthropogenic or not, and so on. But I just want to make this observation. If you believe that there is man-made, human-made climate change, then you must be for nuclear. Nuclear is by far the most environmentally friendly form of energy. So then you're pro-nuclear, which the former head of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, for example, now argues. If, on the other hand, you don't mind climate change, and you think, so what? Just adapt. There's always been and always will be climate change. So who cares whether it's natural or human-made? Well, then you must be for coal, because that's the cheapest. So it seems as if whichever side you're on, if you're on the side of there is a problem, then you must be for coal. If you're on the side that there isn't a problem, then you must be for nuclear. The others will be some sort of mix in between, a balanced energy mix. So the environmental concern tells you you either want coal or you want nuclear. The chances are you want both, and you want renewables, and you want hydro and other forms of power in between. I myself happen to have recently built a green, environmentally friendly, largely off-grid house with my wife. So we consider ourselves to be green. And it's because I'm green, because I'm a greenie, that I'm for nuclear. It is by a gigantic margin the safest and greenest source of energy. And just on the question of waste, which you raised, people think the problem is that it's got a half-life of 500 years or 1,000 years or whatever. The paradox is the longer the half-life, the safer it is. It means it doesn't matter. The dangerous radiation is the stuff that has a half-life of a week or a month or a year or whatever it is. So you want to understand that the nuclear, and it's not even waste, it's actually fuel that can be used when new technologies come along. So it should be stored, actually. It should be called unused energy. Is very small amount of space that you need, very low cost, and very safe, the waste included. So on that, I take a position on nuclear safety, which in the end is economics, because the international standards are completely excessive. They should be dropped precipitously to bring nuclear prices down. And that does, like Anthonie, I want to stress that I'm not at all personally, and the foundation certainly is not at all for or against any particular energy on technological grounds. On economic grounds, we want a balanced mix, which the IRP does not provide for, and B, a level playing field, same rules for all. They must supply all of the electricity at the same level of safety, at the same dispatchability, at the same level of security and permanence, and not pass on the cost to Eskom. The word we used in Parliament, by the way, Mr. Chowki, yes, this is all going back, and we have been invited actually to follow up with our evidence in Parliament, and we are doing that. And as we said over there, we should liberate Eskom. So what the Free Market Foundation wants to do is liberate Eskom from having deals imposed on it by politicians. Let it decide how to generate and what to buy, and the only thing we require of it is that it has a level playing field, the same rules for all. Thank you.